A couple hours. Okay. So today we're going to be reading the book. Very interesting stuff. Chris and John's Journey. I'm very creative at coming up with names. Okay, so don't judge the pictures. It was a bright and sunny day in Ridgewater Creek. The weather was nice and all the animals were going about their business. Chris the tree stood along, somewhere over there, and he was watching the animals walk by him one by one, envious of what they were up to. Later in the day, a squirrel walks right past Chris the tree and eats a dozen acorns right off the floor in front of Chris. Beautiful squirrel. Chris begins to wonder and think about why he cannot eat food, unlike all the other animals, because squirrels can eat food and stuff, and why he's not the same as them. So then questions start to pop up in Chris's mind about he can possibly stay alive without eating any food. And he even has questions about what happens inside of his body. So there's leaf and food and stuff. Suddenly, a bright green ball appears, and he begins to talk to Chris. It's John the chloroplast. John was curious about Chris's sadness and decided to help him by taking him on a journey through how his body works. So this is John. He's all green because he's inside a plant. He's part of Chris, actually. You don't have to know all this. It's just a diagram. But John first showed Chris the basics about the very process that kept Chris alive and made food in his body. So that's one of the big questions that Chris had. How do you make food in a plant's body? And he showed him that the magical process, the name of it was photosynthesis. It's a really long word. I know it sounds boring, but that's what actually makes food in plants. And it basically takes simple things like water. I have a diagram of water here. It takes water and air and sunlight, so it takes sunlight, water, and air, and it all comes together and it makes food in a really long and painful process. Well, not painful for the plant. Then he begins by showing Chris the millions of little things inside of each of his leaves. So if you look on a plant, if you look on different plants, there's different leaves. They have these little things called cells, and there's millions and millions of them on each plant, and they're like little, you can consider them like little people because they have stuff inside of them that help make the plant work. So there's millions and millions of them. You have like millions of cells on your skin, all kind of together and clumped. But these cells are squished next to each other and make the very leaves that Chris had. Inside these little cells are a bunch of smaller little things, a bunch of smaller little structures, kind of like how humans have a lot of things inside their bodies. John the chloroplast was actually one of those tiny little things inside of a cell. So if you can imagine millions of these little circles inside of one leaf, and then John the chloroplast, the guy who's taking Chris on the journey, that guy, he's actually these little green little circles inside of the cell. So it gets smaller and smaller. So John pointed out how there are two major types of these structures. So the green ones that we're talking about, John, this is John, well, many Johns, but these guys are called chloroplasts, and it's another complicated name, but they're the green ones. And then there's the red ones also, who are called mitochondria, and those are also a confusing name, but they make energy, so that's how plants get their energy. And then the chloroplasts, like John, they're the ones that make the food. So to make food, that magical process called photosynthesis must occur. John first started explaining exactly how it started off and how it worked. Do you remember how I told you that to make food, plants need air? Mm-hmm. So basically, if we see this little diagram right here, there's these two little cells, and they open and close, allowing for air to go inside and outside of the plant. It gets a bit confusing, but so basically the air can go in and out, and it allows for the plant to have all the oxygen and all the air that it needs to make the food. And on each leaf, there's thousands and thousands of these little holes that you can't see, but they're all there, and they all help get the air for the plants. Plants also need lots and lots of water to make food and sugar. Basically, sugar is the food that they make, but to make food. And that's why lots of water, that's why you have to water plants every day, or not every day, but every once in a while. What happens is the water, it gets taken up by the roots, and it goes all the way up to the plant, to the leaves, where it will start making food through that photosynthesis process. Now this is where it gets a bit confusing. Inside John, so we have John the chloroplast. You don't have to know this that well, but we have John the chloroplast, and there's a bunch of these little purple things inside of him, and inside of them, they actually absorb the light. So if you remember, we talked about the three things that make food in plants. There's air, water, and then there's light that's needed. So the air that's needed to make food, that's from these little opening thingies. And then the water comes up from the roots. You just water the plants. And then the light, there's these little structures that actually absorb the light. It's kind of confusing how it works, but they actually absorb the light and make it into energy to help out. So all these processes, they're all kind of confusing, and they end up making something called ATP. You don't have to know that, but it's basically energy. That's why I put a star here. And then there's something called NADPH, which is just another thing that helps make food. Then John introduces Chris to Dr. Calvin, a mad scientist who turns air, basically, stuff in the air, to with the help of these things right here. So we have energy and these weird things. With the help of this and air, Dr. Calvin can change all of that into sugar, which is basically food. So this food can be called glucose. This part of photosynthesis, this is the process we're talking about, photosynthesis, is called the dark reactions because Dr. Calvin doesn't use any light. And then this is the light reactions because it uses light. So dark and light. And then, so now that's basically how plants make food. That's the general idea of how to make food. But Chris was also kind of wondering how the stuff in his body works. So you remember how I told you have those millions and millions of little cells and structures on you? So those are called cells, and in each of the cells there's all these different things. So there's a bunch of these guys called John. Remember all these guys inside of cells? And there's also these guys. Well, inside these cells, these millions of cells, there's these guys called, there's a guy called Mr. Nucleus. And Mr. Nucleus is one of John's favorite neighbors, because he's also in the cell. He's in the center of the cell, and he has certain things inside of him called DNA. Maybe you've heard of that. And that's actually what, using this DNA inside Mr. Nucleus, he can actually, that's how it makes everybody different in the world. Because you know how everyone in the world has different faces and stuff? That's because they all have different DNA that makes them different.
Like fingerprint?
And the fingerprint, yeah. The fingerprint is that your DNA makes you have all different fingerprints and all different faces and different genes, basically. That gets a bit complicated, but Mr. Nucleus has all that inside of him. He's in charge of all of that. And then we have the red ones. You remember we saw the red guys and the green guys battling it out. That's because they don't like each other. But these guys, they're the complicated ones. They're called mitochondria. You don't have to remember the name for that, but they're red, and they are what makes. They're another type of thing that makes energy inside plants. So if you see these guys, they make energy, and if you see the green guys, they make food. And then the second to last guy, there's a guy named Mr. Golgi. He looks all funny and weird and waxy-ish, but he's like the mailman of the whole cell. He has these little letters, you can call them letters, called vesicles, and he basically sends the letters to different people or different parts of the cell. So he's basically transporting a bunch of different things to different people, and that's why we consider him the mailman. Then one more important neighbor is the storage of the entire town. So if you see like a public storage when you're driving somewhere, that's what this guy is. And his name is the central vacuole. It's a complicated name as well. But he's really important to storing things. He can store the food that John makes, the green little things make. He can store the food that they make. And he can also, I colored it blue, because it can also store water. So you see how the water can go up the roots and into the leaves. And then inside all the cells in the leaves, there's these things right here, and they store the water. So it gets smaller and smaller. So inside, you remember how I told you you're made up of all these little cells. There's a bunch of different actual type of cells. The one we're talking about right now is only in plants, but there's also cells in animals like you. So you have different cells than plants do. And there's also these weird things with little hairs around them, and they're called bacteria. They're the bad stuff that make you sick. And they're also a type of cell. So John is just showing some other neighbors. These are some other types of cells that can be found in plants or animals, bacteria. And then overall, you've probably learned in your class, the world benefits from having trees because trees, they give off oxygen and air that help us breathe, because without oxygen, we wouldn't be able to survive as humans. So as you can see, if you have more trees and you have forests, that's what actually makes, it gives everyone oxygen and it makes everyone live. So trees are really important to the world.
Don't we make oxygen? Don't we have a part of making oxygen?
Humans, we actually make something called carbon dioxide. Yeah, and then we exhale that, but we inhale oxygen.
Yeah, and plants breathe like carbon dioxide.
Yeah. Plants breathe, and that's what actually, you remember the little holes, these things? The carbon dioxide from the air goes through these things to help make the food for the plants. So after his journey with John, Chris learned a lot about how he just makes his food. He realized how important he is in the world, because without him, then humans wouldn't be able to exist and stuff. And without trees, without trees, plants, and the process of photosynthesis, the one that makes food, people would not have clean air to breathe. This made Chris very happy to realize that he, like all the other, like the squirrel and all the other animals in his Bridgewater Creek, the place where he lived, had a purpose in the world, and that he actually made a difference. So yeah, that's the end of the story. Is there, if I ask you like a couple questions, they're not going to be like asking you what complicated names are or anything. Those are boring. I don't like boring questions. So let's see. Do you remember that big thing I was talking about, photosynthesis, that big word? Do you remember what that does? Like, you don't have to explain it, just what does it make? Do you know?
Oxygen.
Okay. It makes, oxygen and food. That's good, yeah. And do you remember how the oxygen leaves the plant and how the carbon dioxide goes in the plant?
With photosynthesis.
You remember those little holes?
Yeah.
Yeah, they have those little holes, like these things, and it just goes through and in and out. Just like, that's how they transfer the things. Let's see what else. Do you remember that guy, Mr. Golgi?
Mm-hmm.
The weird guy. Do you remember what he did? Do you know what
Like he'd send like...
The letters?
Yeah.
Yeah, he would send letters throughout the whole body? Okay. And then, do you remember where I said how there was Dr. Calvin, and then there's this weird thing? Hard to explain, but there's this weird thing. Do you remember which one's the dark reaction and which one's the light reaction?
Mm-hmm. That one's the dark reaction, that one's the light reaction.
Do you know why this is the light reaction?
Because, like, those absorb light.
Yeah, okay. Because, they absorb light. That's really good. Okay. Finally, do you want to tell me one thing that you've learned that I haven't asked you? It can be anything, really. You can look through the book if you want. Very exciting stuff. Mm-hmm. That's the Mr. Nucleus. Mm-hmm. And you remember how he's the one with the DNA?
Yeah.
And what did you say that was on? That DNA, that code, whatever? Do you remember what that was on?
Fingerprints.
Your fingerprints, yeah. That's what makes everybody different.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the poor drawings in my book. I hope you're a better drawer than I am. Better drawer than I am. Okay, good.